They found themselves surrounded by Ukrainian drones in the white fields where snow was spread out in a geography so different from their homeland. The strategies they had trained so much were not enough to stop that massacre. The pursuit disrupted their advance. They were also surprised in their defenses by enemy special forces. But both the geography and the way they were deployed by the Russians were not typical of those Korean troops. They had much more to show. When fighting the Ukrainians in Kursk, Sergeant Yeong betrayed his homeland filled with guilt and realized that only the armed forces could give him the redemption he needed. He then took up arms and later left for another country, leaving North Korea without even telling his parents where he was going. Maybe not even he fully understood the reason for his departure. All he needed was to follow the orders of the party and the nation's commander. That would be enough for him. Thus, he ended up in Ukraine, fighting for another country, but under the orders of the party to which he was loyal. North Korea is a country shrouded in controversy and mystery, surrounded by highly passionate and polarized legends. For some, it is a dictatorial communist country where there is no freedom and only indoctrination is taught. For others, it is a land where freedom reigns, far from capitalism, and a beautiful and altruistic family keeps its people prosperous and educated. Despite the persecution and rumors from the Western world, it is very difficult to find a middle ground. Even the well-documented Korean War attracts this polarization, with some people finding it perfectly normal. Doing research using highly biased references that demonize North Korea in favor of capitalism, savior of the world, or they become the Great Partnership, the promised land of the communists and the morally superior people of the left from Engloba, who, speaking more, we seek, Ragas is interested. The world is. Electronic shelter. After being led by the Japanese Empire at the end of World War II, the territory was divided into two regions, one with Soviet influence and the other with American influence. In 1948, Kim Il-sung became the leader of North Korea, with Pyongyang as its capital, and with the support of Soviet General Terence Chichikov, who would also become the first ambassador of the Soviet Union to the country. These two managed to get Stalin's support for the invasion of the southern region of the peninsula, taking advantage of the violent political conflicts that were happening there. In 1950, the Korean War had already begun, which would result in an estimated 2 to 3 million civilian deaths. So many deaths should be mourned, but they were often used so that, throughout historical studies or discussions on the internet, they would generate arguments like this. But you have to be extremely cynical to deny the atrocities committed by both the Americans and the North Koreans. But this is a strange world where the testimonies of people who fled those countries mean little, and YouTuber tourism is worth a lot. As information, propaganda showing people crying and loving their leaders is considered truthful. When one side loves this figure and the other This historical cynicism from both sides can't be a surprise. After the war, Kim Il-sung consolidated his power and that of his family. There was also economic growth, even greater than that of South Korea. But stagnation came in the 1980s and declined soon after because support from the Soviet Union ended as it dissolved in 1991. Kim Il-sung died in 1994, but his son, Kim Jong-il, had already taken over many of his duties. It was a hard time, with reports of a famine that reportedly killed 200,000 to 400,000 people. But meanwhile, the pursuit of the atomic bomb continued. Kim Jong-il passed away in 2011, being succeeded by his youngest son, Kim Jong-un. 11 years later came the invasion of Ukraine. Putin had complete confidence in him. Brazil wants the economy to make the economy stronger. Brazil needs the economy to be stronger. Brazil needs to make the economy more. Brazil needs to make the economy stronger. Brazil needs to make it so that the economy is stronger. Be stronger. Brazil needs to be stronger in Brazil. It needs to make Brazil stronger. It needs to make Brazil stronger, to make the economy to be stronger. No. When did the first talks arise about North Korea supplying large reserves of Soviet-era munitions and rockets? In October 2024. The South Korean National Intelligence Service stated that 1,500 North Koreans were sent to Russia for training, with the likelihood of participating in the conflict in Ukraine. The United States supported these claims. Later, new speculations would mention even higher numbers. The first videos about the presence of the North Koreans began to appear, increasing the rumors that they were preparing to enter the battle. Obviously, the features of these soldiers were not conclusive proof. The territory of the Russian Federation had ethnic groups with the same phenotype, such as the Yakuts and the Buryats. There was a conflict of information, with Russian sources denying the presence of North Koreans in the battles and the Ukrainians claiming they were fighting directly against them. Other sources even commented on the subject, such as Chinese mercenaries who fought alongside Russia, while one of them reported that 153 Chinese had already died in battle. The North Koreans were also taking heavy casualties. Therefore, the narrative of Sergeant Yeong's story is mainly based on what the Ukrainians revealed up until January 2025. And you need to keep that in mind when listening to this story. So let it be clear, how is this discussion about the presence of North Koreans in Russia and the story of Yeong? Before Yeong entered the battle, North Korean ammunition had already started to reach the hands of Russian artillery. Russia reactivated the M46 130mm howitzers from the 1960s despite a lack of ammunition production for them. The ammunition used came from old North Korean stockpiles. They were old equipment, but they could still cause damage. The bigger problem was that the various types of ammunition that arrived were not always in good condition for use. At times, the failures were catastrophic for the soldiers. Even so, the stockpiles were important and caused deaths among the ranks of Ukraine. Old or not, this equipment hit their targets and killed soldiers. North Korea also had ballistic missiles like the KN-23, some of which landed in Ukraine, even killing civilians. This type of attack was common among soldiers, with more than 10,000 Ukrainian civilians killed during this time. The difference now was the presence of North Korean technology being used directly in military operations. The KN-23 landed in Brovary, Kyiv region. The flames rose with the fire, reddening the smoke in the Ukrainian night. The impact destroyed civilian structures, causing the death of a 35-year-old man and his 4-year-old son. Another of the new technologies, the Bullseye 4, the system targeted a Ukrainian AC-90 self-propelled 155mm cannon that was tormenting the Russians. The Bullseye 4's guided anti-tank missile hit the target, but the Russians commented that it had an unusual trajectory for a direct-fire anti-tank guided missile and was too slow compared to other projectiles. One of the Bullseye, probably crewed by Russians, was spotted in Kharkiv and came under the sights of Ukrainian ATGMs. In an interview, Kirill Budanov, director of the Ukrainian intelligence service, said that they discovered a pattern. 8 to 9 days after the arrival of a North Korean ship loaded with munitions, hostilities would be intensified to the maximum for up to 2 weeks. Ukraine responded. There were rumors of actions by APIC, the pro-Ukraine partisan military movement, in the occupied territories, as well as in Russian territory, where they allegedly sabotaged the Trans-Siberian railway line. Ukraine also used its weapons to respond to the threat of munitions from North Korea. Their drones fell on an ammunition depot in Soltatskoye in September 2024. There were reports of the destruction of North Korean KN-23 and KN-24 ballistic missiles. Still in the same month, more drones now flew in the direction of Toropetsk. The detonation was so strong that it shook the ground and lit up the night for a few seconds. The main explosion caused a crater 82 meters wide and a seismic wave with a magnitude between 2.5 and 2.8. On September 18, the fire continued into the morning, marking the loss of 30,000 tons of ammunition, which would be about 750,000 shells. Speculation said that the delayed attack destroyed 2 to 3 months' worth of Russia's ammunition supplies. It was after these events that Yeong must have arrived in Russia for his redemption, still with a message kept close to his chest, one that he would only reveal when he met with the Ukrainians. In the meantime, Putin even gave an interview saying that talking about time estimates for the end of the war was counterproductive. This was at a time when he had the advantage on the battlefield, and he was about to receive reinforcements of 10,000 North Korean soldiers to free Kursk from Ukrainian control. It was a very different speech from a man who once said he could take Kyiv in 2 weeks. Yeong would not try to take Kyiv, but rather to liberate part of Russia from an army he didn't know. The Kursk Oblast was invaded by the Ukrainians in a surprise attack in August 2024. The initial advance crushed the Russian defenses. Hundreds of prisoners of war, mostly conscripts with no combat experience, were taken to Kyiv to be later exchanged for Ukrainians. The Russians had difficulty turning the situation around. Months later, a counter-offensive was finally prepared, attacking the Ukrainians from several positions. By December, half the territory was retaken. One of the points of dispute was in Plekov, almost on the border with Ukraine. The fighting resulted in a large amount of destroyed Ukrainian equipment. On the outskirts of the village, the Russian MLRs fired their rockets in lethal volleys into the fields where the Ukrainians were. The artillery put mortars and howitzers to work wherever the drones detected Ukrainians. The Russian attacks left their marks on the outskirts of Kyiv, but the fighting was intense in the region. The drones were also used against Moscow's armored vehicles and troops, destroying several of them at the end of November, even before the heavy snowfall. The defense of the Russians in Plekov was mainly carried out by the forces of the 20th Naval Infantry Brigade, but they had an important reinforcement. Yeong and his soldiers were among the fighters taking part in these missions. The North Koreans began to march in Kursk when the snow was already covering the fields. Yeong was in front of his men, leading them in the cold of Kursk in a massive attack. Most of them were young and highly motivated to finally enter combat for the sake of the party and the nation, even with difficulties. That flat terrain was very different from the mountains of their homeland or the missions trained by the 11th Assault Corps, but determination made Yeong move forward through the snow. It was a large group, a wave of men spread out to minimize the impact of artillery on the group. Even so, the bombs came, and Yeong reminded his comrades about the manual. The Pyongyang troops were supposed to disperse into small groups if they were attacked by artillery. The training taught them that they could hide at the site of the previous attack because they believed that artillery wouldn't hit the exact same spot repeatedly. The Ukrainian troops found the style of advance strange. The Russians' most recent strategy was the use of armored columns. Occupied with ramifications and papers, the left was occupied with theoretical ramifications and papers. Thick on the left, occupied with theoretical ramifications and papers. Soldiers. Day and alerted their colleagues. Yeong told them to remember the training. To overcome the drone attack, when detecting a drone, they should form a team of 3 people. One person would attract the drone by keeping a distance of 7 meters, while the shooters would be positioned between 10 to 12 meters away. If the bait stayed still, the drone would also stop moving. At that moment, the shooters should destroy the aerial equipment with precise shots. After they established their position along a tree line, they rested and began to prepare for the attack on the Ukrainian positions. They set out with their rifles ready, marching with steady steps. Yeong was a sergeant in the special forces. He had confidence in his leader and in his orders. His march did not falter. When the bombs started exploding around him, the men kept moving forward despite the bodies piling up on the snow. The black stains on the ground were frightening, but none of them hesitated, their eyes shining as they focused on the Ukrainians. The 95th Air Assault Brigade received this attack, impressed by the hard advance of that great human wave. Those who approached fired with precision, driven by a fervor different from much of what was seen in the ranks. The Ukrainians still didn't understand how the Russian strategies had changed so radically, but they launched their drones to destroy the wave. Not all the training and instructions were enough to save Yeong's soldiers. There's nothing more terrifying than watching the deadly dive of a drone end in fire and smoke, staining the snow. Amid gunpowder and bloodshed, deaths followed one after another. They were far too easy targets. So many of them scattered in the open field, trudging through the snow and enduring the cold on their faces. Their shots were quick and precise, but even so, they were nowhere near enough to stop the aerial demons. They tried to use their training. A pair was surrounded by the drones. The idea was to shoot the demon while it was distracted by their partner. But theory is easier. Desperation in the midst of deaths, after walking among corpses, with the souls of their compatriots becoming darkened marks in the snow, changed those men. A burst of gunfire at the wrong moment went through the comrade in front, taking down another one on the battlefield. The horror and guilt were brief for the North Korean, whose entire flow of emotions was ended by the explosion. Shortly after, the despair of a man on the battlefield. This could not be measured. The drones flew, searching for the best moment to descend upon a soldier to cause the maximum damage, full of horror. Any action was valid to save oneself, but in the end, the chance of death coming for him was just too great. Dozens of bodies were left lying in that frozen field. There were many wounded and dead. That day, Yeong gathered his men to carry the corpses, and those who couldn't keep up kept moving, while the Ukrainians filmed waiting for the next wave. Yeong. He remembered everything the party led and how he betrayed it. Not giving back as he should have at the time and enjoying that happiness, the suffering now was his chance for redemption. In those moments of observing the first attacks by the North Koreans, a macabre rumor emerged. The Kiev troops claimed to have filmed a soldier burning and disfiguring the faces of the corpses of alleged North Koreans. In any case, after the attacks, images were captured of several corpses with the features of East Asian individuals. But the discussion still continued about whether they were North Koreans, Buryats, Tuvans, Shuktas, or Yakuts. Also remembering that these ethnic minorities had a number of casualties disproportionate to the size of their people, which could even explain so many of their bodies piling up in an attack by the armed forces of a country where they made up no more than 10% of the population. Some videos started to appear showing what were supposedly North Koreans recovering in Russian hospitals. Many of them needed to recover from serious injuries and had contact with Russian soldiers in the same condition. Some of these images sparked private discussions, like one in which a soldier with an amputated leg was presented on one hand as North Korean and on the other as a Buryat. Occasionally, a video would appear of a Russian filming what were supposed to be soldiers sent by Pyongyang, but none of this was conclusive. The Russian government still did not confirm the use of North Korean troops in Kursk, and the Ukrainians continued to insist on their claims. Unlike so many others from his nation who were sent to hospitals, Pyong was still in fighting condition. The sergeant and his men had prepared themselves for orders from the Russian troops. Despite the language difficulties, the conflict continued around a city. Plekov, the 177th Naval Regiment, was also in these battles, but there was a group that had been fighting long before. Yeong had watched the Russians from the 810th in the region for much longer, sending their drones against the Ukrainians. The North Korean sergeant didn't know that those Moscow Marines had suffered greatly in the battles in Kursk, having failed to stop the initial Ukrainian advance and suffering catastrophic losses in combat. Before reinforcements arrived, Pyong began to understand how the Russians prepared their attacks. Upon hearing the explosions, the bombings generated booms that spread across the horizon. The North Korean sergeant listened to that myriad of attacks while waiting for his turn to enter combat again. He scribbled a small note to celebrate a friend's birthday, Songdi, on December 9th and kept it in his diary. He regretted being far from his homeland, but his faith in the fight for the party kept his head held high. He heard about more drones hitting enemy soldiers. In those days, the Russians managed to hit soldiers from Ukraine's 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. The Ukrainians fought back. Drone operators from Ukraine's 129th Territorial Defense Brigade surrounded one of the typical Russian assault squads, walking through the snow. It was normal for the Russians to send groups of 4 to 12 to test the defenses. When defending themselves, the Ukrainians ended up revealing their positions. These soldiers could also hold their ground and clear the way for others. But those Russians weren't so lucky. They were hit in the open field. Even with the resistance, the Ukrainians couldn't hold Plekov. By mid-December, they were forced to retreat to the west. The village was lost, but the region remained contested. The 177th Regiment and the 810th Brigade, along with the North Koreans, continued to force the retreat of Kiev's troops. Sergeant Yeong and his men were in action. Their large groups once again crossed the fields of Kursk. A group of North Koreans was seen moving among the trees. That was the kind of advance they had learned to use in their own land. These special forces excelled at light infantry work because that's what they were made for. Their intended function was to infiltrate rear areas, deceiving the military and the police of war, South Korea. As they quickly crossed the densely vegetated and mountainous Korean terrain, the Ukrainians launched cluster munitions at them. The shrapnel tore through the bodies of several men, some of them agonized on the snow, their blood turning the white red in their final moments of pain. The North Korean movements were hit by precise attacks among the trees. They could try to avoid the fields, but their movements were detected. They continued to act differently from how the Russians operated in Donetsk or Luhansk, advancing at the front in large groups, sometimes in dense formation. When the bombs fell on them, the damage was even greater. There were many successive impacts. Yeong learned about the loss of many of his comrades who fell in the Russian forests. He walked alongside his colleagues with a heavy conscience. The guilt was so great that he wrote in his diary about how he betrayed his homeland once again by stealing from a Russian. When no one was looking, but he was redeeming himself on the battlefield, surviving. He himself wrote that defending the homeland was considered a sacred duty of a citizen, something that made up all his happiness. He would unquestioningly follow the orders of Supreme Commander Kim Jong-un, even if it cost him his life. Later, the survivors were positioned in the middle of the tree line. The Yeong advanced, proud to be fighting against imperialism and to be a soldier in the class struggle. He didn't know that at that moment Ukrainian drones were coming for them. The position was handed over by the 6th Special Purpose Regiment to the artillery. The explosions disrupted the advance to Yeong. He didn't know Ukrainian special forces were already marching through the snow. They surprised the North Koreans and Russians. Hiding from the artillery in the holes they had dug, one of them threw a grenade at the improvised bunkers. The explosion made the men's flesh tremble and tear. The soldiers kept going in hiding, which made the Ukrainians crouch in front of the entrance to the holes and start shooting. With nowhere to go, the men died clutching their AKs, without even having time to use the grenades on themselves, an order they kept to themselves to avoid being captured by the Western demons. Sergeant Jong Hong-yong's diary was captured by Ukrainian special forces, and the less sensitive parts were revealed to the public. According to Kiev, that was one of the pieces of evidence that Pyongyang had sent troops to support Putin, especially for the retaking of Kursk. Russia has not confirmed anything, not even the different style of attacks from the Russians in Kursk. They could be strategies from troops formed exclusively to expel the Ukrainians from there, and the Asian features of those soldiers were still not concrete evidence. Yeong was one of the victims of this mission. With 5 months of Ukrainians inside Russia now, the conflict has put the blood of other nations on that soil. The North Korean troops were being tested, sent to those cold fields, and experiencing Ukrainian fire. Little by little, people started to learn about them, but there was still more story to be told. The 6th Special Purposes Regiment, which praised these North Korean troops, would enter fierce battles, trying to capture some and putting the soldiers' training to the test, as elusive and controversial as their country's politics.